Hey everyone, welcome back. Please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future content. All right, for today, we're taking a look at congressional records from January 6th through the 9th, 2025.
Right at the end of the 118th Congress?
Yeah, and the very beginning of the 119th.
Absolutely.
Should be fascinating to see the changing of the guard on Capitol Hill.
Definitely a dynamic period to examine. You've got the Electoral College vote count happening, but also a new Congress getting started.
Okay, let's break it down. First up, January 6th, 2025. A date with some baggage historically.
Oh, yeah?
But it's also the day we count the Electoral College votes.
Right. And from the records, looks like Donald J. Trump won the presidency.
With how many?
312 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 226.
And the VP.
J.D. Vance secured the win there.
Yeah.
With 312 to Tim Walz's 226.
Interesting. So Kamala Harris, the outgoing VP, actually presided over the count. I can only imagine what it was like for her to declare her own defeat.
I'll bet.
It's been a moment.
Definitely historically significant. And on that same day, the 119th Congress got to work immediately.
Really?
Over 130 public bills and resolutions were introduced just in the House alone.
And the Senate.
Similar, they had tons of activity too.
Wow. So much to cover. Were there any bills that really stood out from that initial wave?
Well, one that jumped out at me was the Lake and Riley Act.
Good.
Both the House and Senate introduced versions.
So H.R. 29
Yep.
and S5.
And what does it do?
It requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to detain any immigrants charged with theft in the U.S.
Interesting.
What?
What was the reception like in the House?
They seemed pretty much in favor. They passed it quickly, 264 yeas to 159 nays.
Okay. But the Senate?
A little more complicated.
Really? What happened?
Well, debate started, but it hit a snag with cloture.
Cloture.
It's a way to limit debate in the Senate and force a vote. You need a supermajority, though.
So that could be tough.
Yeah, especially for something controversial.
So even though it passed the House quickly, it might face hurdles in the Senate?
Exactly. The cloture vote was scheduled for January 9th.
And even if that passes, the final vote won't be until January 13th.
So still a ways to go with this one.
Yeah, lots of debate and negotiation, I'm sure.
Let's switch gears a bit and see what else was going on in Congress. What else stood out to you from the records?
Another significant one was the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, H.R. 23.
Okay.
It passed the House on January 7th, but by a very slim margin, 243 yeas to 240 nays.
Wow, that's close. What's that one all about?
Well, it focuses on sanctions against the International Criminal Court.
Oh, wow.
If they try to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute anyone protected by the U.S. or its allies.
So that could have some serious international implications.
For sure. It suggests a pretty strong stance.
All right, moving on. I noticed that on January 9th, J.D. Vance, our new VP, resigned from the Senate.
Right, effective immediately.
Had to happen, of course, but it leaves a vacancy that needs to be filled.
Exactly. Someone will have to be appointed. And that could shift the balance of power in the Senate, even if it's just a little. And that could affect things like those close votes we were talking about, like with the Lake and Riley Act.
Right, it's all connected.
Yeah.
One little change can have ripple effects everywhere.
Absolutely. And speaking of ripple effects,
Right.
think about that Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act. What happens if that actually becomes law, sanctioning the International Criminal Court? That's a big deal.
What kind of consequences could we be looking at?
Well, it could definitely strain relationships with our allies. You know, the ones who support the ICC, and it might make the U.S. look like it's undermining international justice efforts.
So it might appeal to people here who are like America first, but it could also make us more isolated globally.
Right. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers.
Definitely a lot to think about. Amidst all this legislation, though, I noticed something else interesting in the records. There was this resume of congressional activity in the Senate Daily Digest for January 8th.
Yes. That summarizes everything that happened in the 118th Congress. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day drama, but that gives you a sense of just how much work happens.
The numbers were huge. Over 7,000 pages in the congressional record, 1,300 extensions of remarks, thousands of nominations. It's a lot to handle.
It really shows you how complex the process is. All those pages represent hours of research, debate, negotiation, compromise. And yet, out of all that, only 178 bills actually became law.
So most ideas don't even make it through.
That's right. Lawmaking is a long and tough process. It's more than just speeches and votes. It's about working within a system with lots of checks and balances.
And a lot of that work happens behind the scenes.
Right.
In committees and subcommittees.
Exactly. That's the stuff most people don't see, but it's really important. It shapes policy and makes sure the government runs smoothly.
It's a good reminder that we need to be informed and engaged.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just read the headlines. We need to understand the details of how things work.
Absolutely. These congressional records are just a snapshot, but they give us a peek behind the curtain. We can see how complex and interconnected our political system really is.
Okay, so we've looked at the electoral vote count, the Laken-Riley Act, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, the Senate vacancy, and all that work that Congress does. As we wrap up our examination of these records, what stands out to you as most significant?
The contrast between the big picture and the small details is really striking. You see these big themes emerging, like shifts in foreign policy, the debates about immigration, the power dynamics between the chambers. But then you remember that it all comes down to individual actions, decisions, and compromises.
Like a tapestry. Each thread might seem tiny on its own, but together they create something bigger.
Exactly. And that's a good thing to keep in mind as we continue to follow what's happening on Capitol Hill. It's not just about the big moments. It's about understanding how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's amazing how these little details can end up shaping the big picture. For our listeners out there, paying attention to the small stuff can be just as important as, keeping up with the headlines.
Absolutely. Those details often reveal the true intentions behind things, the motivations, and the potential consequences.
Before we wrap up, though, I want to go back to the Laken-Riley Act for a second.
Okay.
It passed quickly in the House, but the Senate's a different story. What does that tell us about the balance of power between the two?
It's a perfect example of how different rules and structures can lead to different outcomes.
Right.
The House is bigger and moves faster.
Yeah.
So if the majority party is on board, things can happen quickly.
Makes sense?
But the Senate is smaller, more debate, more deliberation. It can act as a check on the House.
It's checks and balances in action.
Exactly. And the cloture rule we talked about, that gives the minority party some power, too. They can slow things down or even block things.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Laken-Riley Act in the next few weeks. Will it pass? Will it get stuck? Will there be big changes?
Lots of possibilities. It'll be fascinating to watch it all unfold.
This is just one of the many legislative battles we'll see play out this session.
Right.
Immigration, foreign policy, the economy. There's a lot on the agenda.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a busy session,
Yeah.
for sure. So for our listeners who want to stay informed and engaged, what advice would you give them?
We'll definitely go beyond the headlines and those little sound bites you hear.
Absolutely.
Read the actual bills,
Yeah.
follow the committee hearings, understand those procedural maneuvers.
All of it.
Don't just rely on social media or partisan news sources. Do your own research. Be critical.
Yes. And remember, Congress works for you. So reach out to your representatives. Let them know what you think.
Great advice. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our look at the congressional records from January 6th to 9th, 2025. We covered a lot.
We did the Electoral College vote count, the Laken-Riley Act, the inner workings of Congress.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating look at a pivotal moment in our history.
And we hope this gave everyone some valuable insights, a better understanding of how our government works.
I hope so.
Keep exploring. Stay engaged. And thanks for joining us.